After the arrival of the Beatles and the British invasion, many of the rockers and crooners who ruled the charts in the late 50s and very early 60s suddenly found themselves struggling to find success. Music and fashion changed, and these stars became outdated almost overnight. And when things started getting psychedelic around 1966 and 1967, they were already seen as stars from a very distant past. But some of them refused to give up and they tried to adapt to the new trends. And there are some overlooked gems among the records and singles that they released. So let's take a look at some of the 50s stars who tried to adapt to the psychedelic 60s. Let's begin. Shannon's music career began in the mid-50s, but it wasn't until 1961 that he scored his first major hit, when his song Runaway reached #1 on the Billboard chart. Shannon still managed to retain some success in the early days of Beatlemania, and he became the first American to cover a Beatles song. His cover of From Me to You actually charted in the States before the Beatles version.
If there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do.
However, his subsequent singles in the mid-60s did not enjoy much success. In 1966, he released a cover of the Rolling Stones' Under My Thumb.
Under my thumb, the girl who once had me down.
But the good stuff came a year later. Shannon teamed up with Stones manager Andrew Oldham in early 1967 and recorded the album Home and Away at Olympic Studios in London.
Baby, it's mind over matter. Give me the strength that I need to carry on.
Such was Oldham's trust in the record that he intended it to be the British answer to Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Liberty Records released a few singles prior to the album release, but the singles were so unsuccessful that the album was shelved, and it wasn't until 1978 that all of the tracks were eventually issued. A terrible shame because it's actually a stunning record. But Shannon still recorded another album in 1967, The Further Adventures of Charles Westover.
Always heavy on my mind, blue eyes.
Even though sales were disappointing, the record got some great reviews in the press, and many critics and fans consider it to be one of the greatest Baroque pop albums ever released. Other stars who faded away after Beatlemania and the rise of the British invasion bands were British rockers of the late 50s and early 60s, such as Billy Fury, Adam Faith or Marty Wilde, among others. Some of these British stars tried to jump on the psychedelic bandwagon around 1967 and 1968 in a last desperate attempt to make a comeback. And again, there are some great overlooked gems to be found among the stuff they released. Adam Faith, who hadn't had a hit since 1962, released the incredible Cowman Milk Your Cow in September 1967.
That could be a million years, and that's a long, long time.
The song was written by the Bee Gees, and rumor has it that Peter Green played guitar on the track, although it's never been officially confirmed. This is by far the most psychedelic track Adam Faith ever released, and the single has become a cult favorite over the years, which explains why this 45 has become a really expensive collector's item. Another British rocker from the late 50s and early 60s who tried to make a comeback was Billy Fury. In early 1968, he released Silly Boy Blue, a song penned by a young David Bowie, whose first solo album had been a massive flop in the summer of 1967. The song was unlike anything Billy Fury had ever recorded both musically and lyrically. It featured a great arrangement by Alan Chew and an irresistible Baroque pop sound. The lyrics were about a teenage runaway and they reflected Bowie's fascination with Tibetan Buddhism. Bowie re-recorded the song later in 2000, and this updated version of the track was officially released in 2022 as part of the Toy album. Marty Wilde also tried to make a comeback during those years. In his case, he tried to make a comeback as a songwriter.
I like ice in the sun, I melt away, and whenever she comes, I melt away.
He wrote the song Ice in the Sun by Status Quo, when Status Quo was still a psychedelic band. And he also wrote Jessamine by The Casuals, which was a pretty big hit in 1968. As a side note, Wild also tried to make a comeback in the early to mid-70s when glam rock was all over the charts. He released a few singles under the name Zappo, with a sound that seemed very influenced by Gary Glitter's music. But let's go back to the American rockers. Roy Orbison still managed to get a big hit during the early days of Beatlemania, when Pretty Woman charted in April 1964. But he struggled to find success throughout the rest of the decade. In 1969, he released Southbound Jericho Parkway, one of the most bizarre songs of his entire career.
Aching, thinking.
The song was a 7-minute sitar-led suite whose lyrics dealt with topics such as the generation gap and the struggles of modern life.
His son in college had dropped out to expand his mind.
The song was released as a single in March 1969, but it failed to chart. The Everly Brothers also saw their popularity decline in the mid-60s. In 1966, they attempted to make a comeback by teaming up with the Hollies, who were all huge fans of the Everlys. The Everly Brothers released the album Two Yanks in England, showcasing 9 songs by the Hollies.
If you get tired of loving him, come right on back to my arms.
The record featured future Led Zeppelin members Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones on guitar and bass. Even though most of the albums they released in the mid to late 60s went largely unnoticed, those records feature quite a few gems. And one of their best songs from that period is She Never Smiles Anymore.
She never smiles anymore. She never smiles anymore.
Despite its lack of commercial success, this is one of those songs that sounds like an instant classic. By 1967, Ricky Nelson seemed like a fading memory from the past. That same year, Nelson teamed up with Koppelman and Rubin, which represented artists such as Tim Hardin and John Sebastian of the Lovin' Spoonful, and the result was Another Side of Rick, a record that revealed a markedly different and unexpected side of him.
Marshmallow sky.
Despite receiving positive reviews in the press, the record was a commercial failure, but the album is a highlight from that period of time when the stars from the 50s wanted to prove that they too could tune in and turn on.
People worship crosses, fingers crossed behind their back. Genuine imitation life.
Another highlight from that era is the Genuine Imitation Life Gazette, a psychedelic concept album released by the Four Seasons in 1969. This incredibly ambitious concept album is by far the most bizarre record they ever made. Lyrically, it was unlike anything they had ever done before, as the Four Seasons satirized about different aspects of American life. And musically, the record was very influenced by albums like Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's. The album was produced by Jake Holmes, the man who wrote and recorded the original version of Dazed and Confused, which was later covered by Led Zeppelin, even though they credited themselves as the writers of the song.
I'm dazed and confused. Is it stay, is it go? Am I being choosed? Well, I'd just like to know.
Despite the quality of the material, the Four Seasons concept album went largely unnoticed, and it failed to impress the record-buying public. However, Frank Sinatra was quite impressed by the LP. In fact, he was so impressed that he asked the album's producer Jake Holmes and Four Seasons member Bob Gaudio to write and produce a concept album for him. The result was Watertown.
Old Watertown.
This is yet another album that shows a star from the old days getting out of his comfort zone during the hippie era. The brooding atmosphere of the LP is reminiscent of artists like Leonard Cohen, and certainly quite different from the kind of material Sinatra was known for.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
The record was a massive flop, and it became his only major album release not to chart inside the top 100 of the Billboard chart. But the album has since been re-evaluated, and many critics now consider it to be one of his finest records. But Sinatra wasn't the only crooner who got out of his comfort zone in the late 60s.
How do you kill the sunshine?
Bobby Darin, who spent most of the 60s switching styles without much success, released a very good and unusual record in 1968. The title of the album was Born Robert Walden Cassato. This was Darin's first entirely self-composed record, and the lyrics dealt with issues such as the environment, the Vietnam War, capitalism, and organized religion. The album alienated his existing audience and failed to appeal to fans of the new breed of protest singers, who probably thought Bobby Darin was just a square. But this is another record that has been re-evaluated over the years. Music critic J.T. Griffith wrote that the album is an overlooked masterpiece painted in bold personal strokes. Just like most of the albums featured on this video, the record was a commercial failure, and it remained out of print for several years until it was finally reissued in 2017. Gene Vincent was another 50s rocker who sought to reveal a different side of himself in the 60s. By 1966, however, Vincent was struggling with severe alcoholism and was plagued by the chronic pain in his injured left leg. That same year, he recorded several songs for Challenge Records.
Love is a bird. Love is a bird. It flies where it wants to.
These sessions demonstrated that despite his personal difficulties, he remained a remarkably talented artist. In fact, some of the tracks revealed a surprisingly compelling folk rock dimension, an unexpected direction from the rockabilly pioneer.
Love is a bird.
But by that point, Gene Vincent's career was on a downward spiral with no realistic prospect of a comeback, and he unfortunately died in 1971 at the age of 36 from a combination of a ruptured ulcer, internal hemorrhage, and heart failure. One of the few 50s stars who reinvented himself in the psychedelic era and actually managed to get a hit was Bobby V. In 1967, Bobby V released a new album called Come Back When You Grow Up. The record was very influenced by the harmony pop of California bands such as The Association. The song which gave the album its title was a moody slice of folk pop, which even managed to reach number 3 in the charts in August 1967.
Come back when you grow up, girl. You're still living in a paper doll world.
Come Back When You Grow Up became the last of 6 gold singles that Bobby V achieved in the 60s.
I wonder why I love you like I do.
Dion and the Belmonts were formed in 1957. After a couple of mildly successful singles, A Teenager in Love reached number 1 on the Billboard charts in 1959.
Each time we have a quarrel, it almost breaks my heart.
In 1960, however, Dion decided to quit the group and go solo due to personal and musical differences. And it was during that period that the singer recorded some of his most popular songs. Run Around Sue and The Wanderer both reached number 1, and his subsequent singles from that period were all top 10 hits. But the arrival of Beatlemania in 1964, coupled with Dion's increasing heroin use, resulted in a period of commercial decline. Even though many people already saw him as a star from another era, Dion was only 24 years old and still very interested in finding out about new music and trying out different things.
I can tell your future, baby, and it'll come to pass.
Dion was very impressed by his Columbia label mate Bob Dylan, and he was introduced to classic blues by John Hammond, the producer who had signed Dylan to the label. Some of his 1965 recordings for Columbia are among the best of his career, and the song Kickin' Child was released as a single in May 1965.
Well, she's a kicking child. She hits a cold 100, and a little girl coasts a while.
Dion wrote and recorded a string of fantastic songs with a sound that mixed elements of folk, rock, and blues with a very strong Dylan influence. But unfortunately, all the singles he released from those sessions were unsuccessful. Dion even recorded an excellent full-length album with Dylan's producer Tom Wilson, but the record was shelved by the label, and it remained unreleased until Norton Records finally issued it over 50 years later, in 2017. Success eluded him until 1968, when the song Abraham, Martin and John became a major hit in America. But even more impressive was Daddy Rolling in Your Arms, the B-side of the single.
Gonna have your sweet love now, Daddy rolling in your arms.
The lyrics were inspired by his experience with heroin addiction, and the song had a very unique sound, dark, haunting and claustrophobic, not very far from the sort of material that the Velvet Underground were doing at the time. Critic Dave Marsh included the song in his list of the greatest singles ever recorded. That same year, Dion also recorded a totally unique and unusual cover of Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix.
Purple haze running through my brain.
Along with Shannon, Dion is one of the pre-Beatlemania stars who made the best transition to the mid to late 60s. Chubby Checker, who took the charts by storm with his Twist singles in the very early 60s, was another artist who got out of his comfort zone during the hippie era. His album Checkered couldn't be further away from the sort of records he was known for in the early 60s. The album was heavily influenced by Hendrix, and it also featured some very tasty, soulful moments. It reveals Chubby Checker as a great and very versatile singer, and his strong and impassionate voice is one of the highlights of the album. Despite the quality of the material, the album proved to be a commercial failure, and just like many of his contemporaries, Chubby Checker soon found himself pushed onto the oldies revival circuit.
The edge of reality.
The early to mid-60s aren't usually remembered as one of Elvis Presley's best periods. His films seemed to get worse and worse, and many of his fans were disappointed by the movie music he was recording. However, Elvis still remained a very popular figure during those years, and he didn't really need to adapt to new trends. But even Elvis Presley recorded a song with strong psychedelic overtones. The song Edge of Reality is one of the weirdest songs he ever recorded, with some of the most unusual lyrics of his entire career.
Here's where life's dream lies disillusion. The edge of reality.
Film director Cameron Crowe chose Presley's performance of Edge of Reality in his top 10 musical moments in film. Cameron Crowe wrote, "Elvis's weariness and unpreparedness sometimes created seismically funny and unintentionally profound sequences like this one. This was Presley's only foray into psychedelia. It's appropriately trippy and you can't quite believe it exists."
Singer presents Elvis, starring Elvis Presley, in his first TV special, his first personal performance on TV in nearly 10 years.
A few months later, in December 1968, Elvis Presley's comeback special relaunched his singing career and his return to live performance.
Is that singer today?
Long distance information, give me Memphis, Tennessee.
Another artist who started recording in the 50s and managed to retain his popularity throughout the 60s was Johnny Rivers. Rivers recorded his first single in 1956 when he was just 14 years old, and his ability to adapt to new trends allowed him to hit the charts several times in the 60s. In 1968, he released a psychedelic album called Realization. This record marked yet another change in his musical direction. The song Summer Rain was released as a single and became a top 10 hit in January 1968.
And the jukebox kept on playing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
But one of the highlights of the album was his cover of Hey Joe, with a great 2-minute intro. The album reached number 5 on the charts. The Tokens is a name that may not immediately ring a bell, but I'm sure everyone is familiar with this song. Their recording of The Lion Sleeps Tonight was a massive hit on both sides of the Atlantic in 1961. In the late 60s, the Tokens recorded the album Intercourse, a wildly psychedelic record that was as bizarre as it was brilliant.
I want to make love to you.
Some of the songs were very influenced by the Beach Boys' most experimental stuff.
I've been waiting for you, she said. You have a very, very comfortable bed.
Other songs escaped categorization.
Animal, 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 animal. Why don't you admit what you are? Since you don't believe in God. Smokes too much, loses touch. Is fishing for a fishing rod.
Their record label turned down the album because they considered it was too uncommercial, and the Tokens ended up releasing an edition of 200 copies on their own label for contractual reasons. But the album has been reissued a few times over the years, and it's definitely worth checking out.
Sweet little Sheila, you'll know her if you see her.
Tommy Roe became a major star in 1962 when the song Sheila became a massive hit, and the singer was a first-hand witness of the changing times. After the success of the single, Tommy Roe flew to the UK to headline a tour along with Chris Montez. Totally unaware of what was going on in Britain, the New Musical Express was soon carrying a story about how both Tommy Roe and Chris Montez were being upstaged by their upstart newcomer support act, the Beatles. The two American stars soon realized that the hysterical fan action was directed at the four mop tops from Liverpool. Tommy Roe managed to return to the charts in 1966 with the song Sweet Pea.
Oh, sweet pea, come on and dance with me. Come on, come on, come on and dance with me.
In 1967, his label teamed him up with the association's producer, and the result was It's Now Winter's Day, an excellent record full of thick harmonies, weird rhythmic shifts, oblique lyrics, ethereal arrangements, and even some great fuzz guitars. A couple of years later, his song Dizzy was a #1 hit on both the US and the UK single charts.
Got my mojo working, but it just don't worry, it's gonna do.
Even blues artists like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf experimented with psychedelic sounds. The success of bands like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds in the mid-60s helped spark interest in the music of the two bluesmen. And in 1968, Chess Records decided to record 2 albums of experimental psychedelic blues with members of the band Rotary Connection, who backed the two bluesmen. The result was the album Electric Mud by Muddy Waters. The Howlin' Wolf record was simply titled The Howlin' Wolf Album.
Yeah, you know I'm a tomcat and use my kitten. Good bears full of dimes. Good bears full of gold.
The two bluesmen were not particularly pleased with the sound of their albums, and Marshall Chess even alluded to Howlin' Wolf's dissatisfaction with the arrangements on the album cover. Electric Mud by Muddy Waters sold 150,000 copies within the first 6 weeks of release, peaking at number 127 on the Billboard chart and becoming his first album to appear on the Billboard and Cashbox charts. The Howlin' Wolf album, on the other hand, was a flop. Blues purists hated the albums, but they both have achieved a cult reputation over the years, and they are 2 very interesting records with a unique mixture of blues, psychedelic sound effects, wah-wah pedals, and fuzz guitars. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to this strange period in the history of rock and roll when the stars of the 50s tried to adapt to the psychedelic 60s. See you next time.